So this is a blank slide on which we're going to build things. So here on the right, you can see the world, which can be perceived in many different ways. World in which we live, but also where there are problems and coming problems, and you know this better than I do. And this world interacts with things that we as humans produce, like policies or regulations that try to kind of like coordinate or govern this world, or influence this world in different ways, better or worse ways. Those policies are generally created by political institutions, such as governments or international organizations or the EU. And then those political institutions basically have a process that is called policy making that blends many different things. So it blends like networks of interest groups and lobby groups and associations. It blends also analysis and facts. Yes, it happens. And it also blends emotions and whether they are like positive emotions or like negative emotions. And basically policymaking is the process in which like you have all of these inputs that gets blended and then that spits out those policies that affect the world. Of course, it's very schematic. And that's you. This is XR in green. And the idea that I understand from what you want to do is that you want to be one of these inputs that will have some impact on the institutions, which will then have impact on what is produced by those institutions, and hopefully lead to a better world. That's a very brief summary. Basically, like any other political group. The problem is that we have uncertainties about how the world works. Like we understand some of climate, but not all climate is figured out. We don't really understand necessarily the interplay between policies and the world. So like we know that we have policies, but we don't really know how exactly they affect the world. There are uncertainties on how the institutions actually produce policies, whether do you have like clear causal effects or not. You have a lot of uncertainties on how those institutions actually work. It's kind of like a black box in which many convoluted processes happen. You have uncertainties on the influence of groups on those institutions. You have uncertainties on who is actually trying to influence institutions. And in your case, you may also have uncertainties about yourself and about XR and about whether what you try to do will work and to what extent, etc. And so that's a pretty uncertain picture, which is fine because that's just reality. Bad news is that this process is also not even linear. So like even this like kind of like complicated figure is not very representative of reality, because in reality you have other feedback loops in all directions that complicate a bit everything. So if you have so many uncertainties, what we can be is uncertain, which can lead to paralysis. Basically, we don't really know how to influence, or like it's difficult to know how to really influence, and therefore we sometimes don't know what to do. In response to that, some people say, fuck it, let's fight, and everything is relative, and we cannot know anything, so we just go rogue, and we fight. But I think that that's one strategy, but another strategy is try to think a bit more carefully about the processes of policymaking and how we can influence them. And I'm going to use the analogy of chess throughout my presentation because I like chess, but also because I think it's a very good analogy for politics and policymaking. All right, so that's the main figure, and that's the focus of this workshop. It's basically how a political group like you can influence political institutions. I'm not going to talk about the right-hand part of the figure. Yeah, so if you zoom in this, you have that, and in that you will have the structure of my talk. So we have the first part on understanding policymaking processes. It's going to be me talking a little bit like this with figures. And then we have a second part, which will be about tactics to influence policymaking. So it's basically, given one, what can we do? And then third is then how can you use 1 and 2 in a theory of change? And in this case, your theory of change. And then 4 is, yes, it's all great to think about 1, 2, and 3, but at the end of the day, we're a group and we need to make collective decisions, and that's also kind of difficult. So I will introduce you to a tool that you can use to help your decision making. Is this kind of clear, or yeah? Cool. Okay. So first part, understanding policy making processes. So it's what we try to do here is try to look at the game without necessarily engaging in it. So it's like if you would look at two grandpas playing chess, and you would try to figure out how they play, and you would figure out the rules and what is allowed and what works. So that's kind of the position we are right now. And in fact, if you look at policymaking, you have many different ways to look at it. You can look at it as a black box, like many American political scientists, that basically say you have some input, and then if you change the input, you have a different output. But you don't look at what's in the box. So that's, I would say, a useless way to look at it. A different way to look at it is to look at formal procedures between different branches of government or of policymaking processes, such as the interaction between parliaments and the executive, and etc. You can look at the policy cycle, and I will get to that. Basically, like the process of formation of policy. You can look at macro trends. By that, I just mean you try to measure things about policymaking activity, and you try to then deduce conclusions based on that. Or you can look at it as a social network. So you can look at it as basically a set of humans that interact and whose interaction leads to the emergence of policies. And with no surprise, that's the lens I'm going to use. And this lens actually allows us to integrate formal procedures, policy cycle, and macro trends in it. So it's a pretty inclusive view on policymaking processes. So what we try to do is understand policymaking from the bottom up. So with a network of actors that basically interact in an environment. And this environment consists of like a changing world, the media, and institutional structures. There are more elements, but that's basically what happens at the micro level, at the bottom of policymaking. And then you have this process, basically this interplay between different individuals that then produce policy outcomes, policies, regulations, redistributions, standards, norms, speeches, etc. And as those policy outcomes then re-influence the environment. And that's the summary figure of all my talk. But I'm going to zoom in and out in this. Okay? So just before I zoom in and out, I just want to briefly introduce the policy cycle. So this is like a wrong model. Just like something that is useful to get a sense of what policymaking is all about. So you usually have like a stage of agenda setting, which is the stage when NGOs and politicians and bureaucrats try to like prioritize problems, so things that they think are important. And after they've done that, they try to formulate solutions, policies to those problems. Then at some point there's the stage of adoption, which is when, for example, the parliament has to adopt a policy. Then you have the implementation, usually done by bureaucrats and NGOs and associations. Then you have the evaluation of those policies, and then you have the support and maintenance of those policies. And that's all of policymaking processes. And this talk is mostly about agenda setting and a little bit about policy formulation. But it's mostly about how do we get people to prioritize certain problems, because that's kind of the main issue we face. In reality, it's much more complex. It's actually not that linear. It actually goes in all directions with back and forth, but that gives you just like a broad idea of what happens inside a government. So look back at the figure. If we look at policy outcomes first, so we actually start from the top. This is a figure. I'm not going to go too much in details, but this captures the rate of change of the US budget over 200 years, which means that you have almost only a straight line around 0, or like between 0 and 4, which basically represents percentages of changes in the budget over time. And except for like this spikes, the budget actually is fairly stable, especially since 1950. After the 2 world wars, where you have like large changes, the budget is fairly stable. And you have like, that represents almost 50% of political science research is trying to explain this. And they want to explain this because they found this regularity in the US, but also all European democracies and China. So like, it seems that like all governments seem to have budgets that barely change over time, like only 2 to 4% on average. And that's like empirically on 200 years, yes?
What's the budget, the total money the government spends every year?
Exactly, yes.
So you mean like GDP would go whoop, but the budget would stay the same?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that's kind of frustrating because when we have political goals, we tend to think about like radical changes, like budgets must look completely different. And of course that's what we want to create. But if we look at the data, we see that changes actually are incremental. So that means that you can have small changes and small changes and small changes and small changes, and then all of that together might actually be a big change. And that's kind of the empirical expectation you can get of a policy system. So that means that policy outcomes are not proportional to the input. That's valid for almost all democracies in China. An application here is that you can have 40 years of climate science, but the policy response is not proportional to that. And that's true for many other things. When I said not proportional, I say under proportional, or like super proportional. So it's basically, you can have sometimes 9/11, the terrorist attack that happens, and then you have like a major shift in US policy on war on terror. But the event itself is actually not that important, but it's very emotional, and then you have a disproportional response to this. So that means that the process is, yes?
What are the 2 outliers there?
So one, the most recent one is after the First World War, and the one after 1850. I was trying to figure that out on the train, and maybe someone knows.
Civil War.
Yeah, there we go.
So it's the percentage of change. So it means that it's stable, and then suddenly it is multiplied by 5, and then it stays there more or less. So it, like the budget increased, but it increases.
Well, it's not the amount. It's the
rate of change.
It's the rate of change of the budgets. So like a budget might have like entries of like the resource allocation, and basically that captures how many of the entries change. So basically the reallocation of resources, not the size of the budget.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Ah.
So like the budget can expand or like be reduced. It's not captured by this. What's captured by this is like how much, like to what extent the budget is reallocated, which is why it's problematic. Yes. Okay. Donc cette figure-là, elle capture la quantité de changement que tu as dans un budget national en termes de réallocation des fonds. Donc tu peux avoir par exemple 0%, ce serait le budget année 1, et la même chose que le budget année 2. Ce serait 0% de changement. Si tu aurais 1% de changement, tu aurais quelques réallocations du budget sur d'autres problèmes ou d'autres solutions. Et en gros, sur plus ou moins 200 années, ce budget reste très stable. 2-4% qui changent, et ça s'applique dans presque n'importe quelle démocratie. Donc, the process is non-linear. It's not like you have an input and then you have a equal output. To just like build intuitions on non-linearity, this is like a forest fire model. which says that like a forest will basically burn as a function of the density of the trees. And here you have like 58% of density, so like the green are trees, and like 58% of this square is covered with trees. And then that leads to like the forest burning to like around 10%. Okay, cool. Doesn't mean anything for policy yet. What I want basically you to understand is that you can have very slight changes in the density, so like in one certain value, and you can have drastic changes in the effects. So you move from like 58 to 59% of density in this like toy model, and you end up with an outcome that is completely different. Which means that for policy processes, you can have sometimes very small changes that will lead to drastic effects, or you can have huge changes, such as 40 years of climate science, and very small changes, very small outcomes. So that's kind of like an intuition we need to develop to understand those complex systems. So we can ask why, and that's what most political scientists try to answer. And the main response is friction. Basically, it's difficult to reallocate huge amounts, like billions or trillions of Swiss francs rapidly. And that's probably also because governments have the size of cities. So, like, if you want a city to align on certain problems and to agree on one thing, it will take some time. So that leads us to basically the micro-level processes, so like the policy network. And I'm going to dive into this. And one first part of those micro-level processes is political behavior, so Verhalten. So if you look at the policy network, that would be, I don't know, like some people from UDC that are linked with some people in PLA, that are linked with NGOs, and then the PES, and then people inside government, and then people outside government as well. And then each of these individuals arguably are humans. And we tend to forget this. We tend to forget that a bureaucrat cannot be fully rational, or we tend to forget that even someone at the UDC has emotions. And it's very important to remember this, because that will affect how we actually convince those individuals. So the components of political behavior, very briefly summarized, consist of beliefs, so things that people believe in. Usually we talk about 3 levels of beliefs. So we talk about core beliefs, which can be things that are very deep ideologies that people believe in, and that will almost never change. Then secondary beliefs, which can be more like some kind of like political orientation that can evolve over like long time periods, maybe like 5 to decades. And then policy beliefs, which is what people think should be done at a certain point in time in policy. And those beliefs basically kind of like characterize orient the behavior of an individual in terms of preferences and in terms of how this person looks at the world. From left wing to right wing to whether we should have urgent action or non-urgent action. The other component is something called in academic realm bounded rationality. So rationality would basically be we have unlimited cognitive power and we have full information, which means that we can do almost everything, which is what is usually assumed in like economic models, which is arguably not true because we know a little bit from psychology. So we basically have cognitive constraints, which means that we have limited memory. We can only process a certain amount of information at a time. There's another one. We have basically learning abilities that are not perfect. You can not just learn something by reading it. You need to like repeat this, or you cannot necessarily have like experience in the world, like political experience, and perfectly see what you did right and what you did wrong, and then integrate this in your beliefs. And one result of that is that political actors have limited attention. That means that they cannot focus on all policy problems at the same time. So you have almost like an infinite number of policy problems, and they only can focus on a subset of those problems. And the key problem of politics is that you have individuals that focus on different subsets of problems, and then the whole part of politics is trying to convince people to actually focus on the same thing and ideally in the same way. But the way this limited attention changes is a function of the environment, so a function of interactions with others, a function of what happens in the world, and I will get to that. But another key part of behavior is emotions, and you probably know much better than I do about this. But basically, you have in the literature this concept of emotional flow, and I will give you an example, which is, for example, when people are feel fear, and then they feel hope as a sequence, then that can trigger engagement to then contribute to a certain cause. And basically, you could try to have political activity that target beliefs and bounded rationality, but if you do not take emotions into account, you will probably fail at creating engagement in your audience. So that's very broadly what political behavior is about. Emotions, just another example, migration. On migration, I can show you a figure with a diagram and numbers, and there are too many information on one thing, and say, well, this is the situation on migration. I can also show you this, and you will probably react at a visceral level differently. You might say it might be frightening, or it might be, or the police is actually frightening. Or I can also show you this, and I don't want to go further there because it's quite awful. And you see here you have emotions, like you have some reactions that are different than being intellectually convinced by a cause. So that's looking at single individuals. In policy, you basically need to look at those different individuals that interact. So that forms like a policy network. So many people that have beliefs that are bounded rational and that have emotions that create this like brouhaha and chaotic process that is a policy network. One key dynamic in the policy network is something called belief homophily. So that means that usually a policy network of people that closely interact tend to actually develop similar beliefs. So, I mean, you probably share similar beliefs. If we now put you 10 days in one house, you will develop even more similar beliefs. And I believe that if you would interact with a very different group, and then to a large extent, you will start sharing common beliefs with this group as well. And that's because you basically have reflections of yourself in others, so you can see what other believes, and that gives you information on what is true in the world and what people should believe. And therefore you have this process where like when someone has believed, then this belief kind of like spreads in networks. And that's a very common process in politics, where like, for example, you're gonna have one person that has a certain belief that is charismatic enough, and then this belief might actually well spread in a network. And then you have institutions, maybe like political parties that try to sustain those beliefs. If we look at policy networks, there are key positions in networks. That might be a bit abstract, but I think it's good to think about this for strategy. You can be central in a network. That means that you have more connections than other people. So usually very influential people in policy have an extensive network. They generally know more people than others on expectation. You can also choose in-between positions. So you, for example, you're someone that is between two political parties, and you know people on one party really well, and you know the people on the other party also really well, and you can speak both languages, and you can make the connections when needed. And that's like a powerful position. But you can also have what is called like a close position, which is that you don't necessarily have many network connections, but the connections you have are of like extremely high quality. So like your connections are almost like friendships, and that basically strengthens trust, strengthens coordination, and basically the resilience of your network. And arguably in policy, people try to like navigate between those three positions to then influence the processes where they want. Speaking about policy network, there's a concept called ambiguity, which I think is important. So if someone says climate change, and the other people that arguably are of similar beliefs say climate change, good news or bad news? Generally, I think we would tend to assume it's good. It's good that people seem to agree, or like at least they kind of like spread the same word. But the problem with like ambiguity is that a cause, climate change, can be unpacked in many, many different problems. So you can care about climate change because you care about current generations, or because you care about future generations, because you're anti-capitalism, or because you're pro-capitalism, because you're pro-green technologies, or you want to reduce inequalities, because you want to reduce CO2 emissions, because you care about biodiversity, and because you care about local consumption. And for example, there was this interview of this very young UDC politician, and the journalist asked her, why don't you care about climate change? And she said, I do care about climate change, and UDC is actually the first party that said that we need to consume locally, which is very ironic. So, for example, here, that means that you can say, I care about climate change, but that doesn't mean that's for the same reasons as what others actually do. Which means that maybe it actually helps agenda setting, so people might actually agree on climate change being a problem, but once it moves to the policy formulation phase, people might disagree on the solution to implement, because people have different like sub-goals. And the problem is that you have an unlimited number of problems, so if you take migration, well, migration is also related to many of those, and is also related to climate change. Therefore, the problem is that you have kind of this cacophony of people caring about problems, but the problems, because of their complexity, is kind of like ill-defined, and that basically prevents knowing whether people are completely aligned or not. And that's like a key difficulty, but it's also a key instrument for politics, because you have ambiguity because of complexity, but you have ambiguity because of politics. That means that someone like this young USA politician saying, I care about climate change for local consumption, then this person can seem nice towards the left and can seem nice towards the right. And this person can just use climate change because climate change is such like a big thing that is so complex that you can also use it, you can almost use it in many different ways, that you can appeal to many different audiences and like collect votes this way. So like ambiguity is just a big problem, which is reinforced by politics itself. Collective decision making. So policy networks, or like policy making, is kind of like a huge collective process where people try to make a collective decision on what we should do in the world. And here we will just briefly talk about different policy situations. So here's an axis with scientific certainty, where you have more uncertainty towards the left and less certainty towards the right. And here on the axis you have a level of agreement, with more agreement at the bottom and less agreement at the top. And basically you have 5 locations where it's very certain and where people agree. That's why it's called rational. So that exists. There are like some policy areas where like we actually know what to do and people seem to agree what to do. And we generally don't talk about those, and the media doesn't care about this. But thankfully it happens and things actually get done. You have the political part where you actually know the science, but people disagree. Climate can actually be there, depending if you look at the problem or the solution. But the problem is clear from a scientific point of view, but the agreement is not necessarily there. And then that can be like a technical problem where people seem to agree, but we basically need more knowledge to make progress. And then you kind of have like a chaotic situation where like we don't know and people don't agree. And that happens actually quite rarely, where we actually don't know anything and people completely disagree. But most cases in policy actually operate in this like complex space where you have some certainty and some agreement, which means that the people that disagree can then use the certainty and the uncertainty in different ways. So they can use scientific facts to make arguments, and then they can use the fact that the facts are uncertain to make opposite arguments, and that make basically the situation quite complex. So there was one part in this talk that I removed, which was about knowledge and decision making, and I'm not going to talk about this. What I just want to say is that collective decision making is more than just like a function of knowledge. That means that you can have the best knowledge possible with the most intelligent actors, with the best representation of individuals. And you might still not be able to make good collective decisions because collective decision making is subject to many other processes such as good communication, good facilitation, belief alignment, and etc. And in academia, for example, many people think that, oh, we should bombard policymakers with more knowledge, and that doesn't work. In 40 years of climate science, disproportionate policies. Okay, cool. So we looked at this. We looked at policy network. Now we look briefly at the environment. If we look at like a changing world, that means that like this policy network, you, I, and other people, we do also respond to what happens in the world. So like in the world there might be more or less poverty, there might be climate disasters, and that basically sends signals to us on how we should respond or like what's important. And that relates to like three things I mentioned, which is limited attention, ambiguity, and belief homophily. So limited attention is that we're going to shift our attention when you have strong signals. So like a large event that will say, ooh, this is important, and then people will be like, oh, wow, okay, let's go. Ambiguity means that you can have a big event that happens, and people might say, let's use this event to focus on this, because this relates to something else, and that can basically happen. So people that are really good in policy can instrumentalize the news for their own goals. And they're really good at building basically the association between what is in the news and their own goal. And then belief homophily is that you may have an event that happens, and then some people will get convinced that this is important, and then you have a contagion of this belief. And key examples are 9/11, you have the tsunami in Fukushima, basically tsunami in Fukushima, and then you have many European countries that say, oh, we actually need to revise our energy policy. And then you have Germany that says, we won't use nuclear anymore. And you have the Swiss Green Party that says, let's do an initiative to ban nuclear energy. And this initiative almost passed because people were more sensitized to the threat of like nuclear power. So that's like, that basically creates those spikes in budget changes. That's one source of it. And COVID is another thing. And it doesn't mean that it's more or less important. It's just that it's very present. And it feels very present to the population, to the politicians, and it grasps our attention. Yeah, so that's basically what will happen. And that's what I said. So those events are usually basically at the root of those spikes. I will get to this, but like those events are not enough because you can have a huge disaster, but if nobody knows about it, you won't have response. So you still need some media coverage, and you still need people to actually instrumentalize the media to then like advocate for a given problem. The media, talking about it, so the media can influence policy processes in different ways. Very briefly, the media can tell policy actors what to think, so in terms of what kind of beliefs people should have. So they can influence, you have right-wing and left-wing media, for example, that will propagate different types of beliefs. But they will also tell them what to think about. So they will cover news and say, oh, this is a big event. And then people might think, oh, then I will think about this and this will be my political role. Or policy actors can actually tell the media what to write about, which is called indexing. So very often policy actors, for example, politicians, interact with the media, and then policy actors can basically choose what they say to the media such that then the public will know what is said this way. And then media is also a shortcut for policy actors to know what the public thinks. And because the media is basically the interface between like high-level politicians and the public. And basically, the media will trigger responses by the public, which will then feed back into what politicians think about the public. Or the media might conduct polls and surveys that can like tell politicians what the publication says. The media, that said, doesn't focus on everything and nothing. It actually it tends to focus on emerging policy fields rather than well-established ones. So it's not necessarily a function of importance. It's like things that tend to be innovative and new tend to be more covered. Media seems to cover more where you have a lack of consensus, and also when you can actually use sensational news that appeal to emotions. And that probably feeds back in the fact that media needs to sell newspapers and etc., and therefore needs emotions to increase readership. And then in terms of influence, the media actually has more influence on agenda setting than policy design or implementation. So it's one of these processes where it's mostly about, okay, what are important problems and what should policy focus about? But once this is set, the discussion kind of moves to bureaucracy and like policy design and like trying to figure out solutions, and those spaces are much more silent. Institutional structures, I will be very quickly there because there is a lot of content. So here, until now, we basically discussed almost kind of like any policy network in a world with media and events that happen. But in policy context, policy actors basically have incentives according to some formal structures that are implemented. So there might be different party systems. Different countries have different party systems. You can have 2 parties or multiple parties. And depending on this, you will have different incentives on what to do, like whether you want to join, whether it is very costly to join one party or another, or whether it is not because you have multiple parties so you can navigate a bit more easily. You have different cabinet structures, different relationships between executive and legislative, different electoral systems, different interest group structure, different division of power, different parliaments and congresses, different constitutions and central banks. And basically, all of those kind of like are the rules of the system. So like basically, I kind of like shape the goals of like what policymaking achieves. And that means that a strategy that you have, for example, in the UK might actually not work in Switzerland because you have a different party system or you have a different electoral system. And in many political strategy contexts, you need to think about those structures to see how you fit best with them. Yep, and then if we have some understanding of those micro-level processes, we can think about, but then how do those processes lead to policy outcomes? There are different ways to explain this. One is this idea of like adaptive coalitions. So in a large policy network, people will develop different beliefs, and then you will have coalitions that form of basically groups of people that think one thing and the other group thinks another thing. And this group will basically not necessarily fight, but they will debate. And you will have this interplay. You may have people that actually shift sides in this process. But usually the way you find consensus between those is through policy brokers. So basically, actors that are networks on both sides, they can speak languages on both sides, that understand the reference systems of both sides, and they can say, this is maybe the compromise we can have. And usually, almost any policy change can be traced back to the existence of those policy brokers. You can have positive feedback loops. So this is a dynamic model which will start soon. So you have some information input X, let's say like a disaster. You have some system processes like the media, coalition 1 and coalition 2, and policies. And basically the system shows positive feedback loops, which is the media coalitions and coalition 2 will relay the information X, and we basically positively relay it. We say, oh, this is good, we agree with this, we should focus on this. And there will basically be positive feedback loops between all of these actors, which will then lead to a high likelihood of policy change. The counterpart of this is negative feedback loops, where you can have the same system, where you can have actors that will basically respond differently to the information. So you can have some actors that will say, well, I'll actually respond negatively to information, and I will not spread this further. I will say that this is not important. And you will see that the actors in the middle will alternate between, oh, this is important, this is not important, but the policies will actually not be created that much, because they don't receive as much like reinforcing input from the information. This sounds very academic, but anyway, it's visual at least. You have what is called policy feedback. So that means that once you have a policy outcome, this outcome will actually feedback on the policy processes. So it will shape the relationship between institutions and citizens. So if you have a government that creates a policy that is very maybe like a lot of surveillance or like a lot of control, you may have a resulting effect, which is the citizens maybe like having less trust in government, and that will basically feedback in policy processes. You have policies that will basically be an indicator of whether policy actors are successful in what they try to do. So if you're a parliamentarian and you manage to have a legislation that goes through, that gives you information about your strategy being correct, and etc. Then people will calibrate as a function of the output. It also provides information on the success and failures of coalitions. And then you have political parties that may adapt as a function. And then policies will reinforce certain problems. So if you have an HIV policy, and that will be public, maybe the public will vote on this. This will basically inform almost everybody that HIV is something to care about, and that will increase the perceived importance of HIV to the public. You have policy transfer, which is basically the situation where you have one institution, let's say the Swiss government that implements something, and then you have the German government and the Italian government that implement the same thing because they see that it works in Switzerland, and then they will basically replicate this. And you have this in the reforms of like welfare systems in the 90s. You have this in the bicycle sharing system in cities in Europe, when you have like one city that implements something and then like many cities implement the same. And that's like one key thing, because it's so uncertain and difficult to create policies that if you see that it works elsewhere, then you have incentives to do it. It might be horizontal, but it might also be vertical. So it might be the EU that says, we need to implement this, and then you have all EU countries that have to do it, and then all maybe cantons or regions that do the same. So that's a way like policy change actually happens. Policy learning, so you have an institution that influences reality with policy. In turn, we'll basically learn from reality. So we learn whether like a policy works or a policy doesn't work, whether a very effective policy actually does not fit people's emotions, and we need to account for this as well. So then we basically learn over time. but parties or networks or groups can also learn. So it's not just the institution that learns, it's also like the networks and individuals as well. But the thing is, learning can be biased because the world is uncertain. So like the information you get and the conclusions you make can be actually wrong. So you can actually learn the wrong things at the time. Because the world is uncertain, but also because we evolved monkeys. And like this is not an insult; it's just a fact. We evolved monkeys, and that means that like we can have like a confirmation bias where we will learn, or we will reinforce what we already think, and those kind of like shortcuts that are somewhat suboptimal. So learning is more adaptation, and you can think of policymaking as being a very long kind of like experiment of a lengthy, slow, complex process that produces outputs that influence reality and that will then feed back into policymaking. And it's extremely slow, yes, but at the end of the day, you still have policies and you have law and you have some governance that happens. So that's one way to explain it. Something that is a bit more concrete is called policy entrepreneurship. So that's a quote that says, many actors and organizations participate in policymaking or seek to influence decision makers. Most of these participants are comfortable working with established institutional arrangements, you probably know about that, doing their bit to achieve improved outcomes for themselves and their supporters without upsetting the status quo. So basically most people behave like this. The policy entrepreneurs distinguish themselves through their desire to significantly change current ways of doing things in the area of interest. So basically policy entrepreneurs are like specific subgroups in policy that really want to change things, where like most people are actually comfortable in the way things work. And she said, the people that are really influential are the ones that are able to reshape networks for their purposes. They are usually invisible, like a civil servant, so not necessarily a politician. And they are not in the minutes of the meeting, but write the minutes, or they organize the meetings. So that gives you kind of like an idea of like if you're an actor in this complex processes, some people have the tendency to think, oh, I will be the front-facing actor that is really good at politics and with a really good charisma, and etc. But in fact, it seems that change is like, or like influence actually comes from like people that actually work in the dark. And that's quite interesting for us, but also other groups, because it doesn't mean that we necessarily need to become like front-facing politicians. It means that we can also work in the dark. Policy entrepreneurship requires different skills. So one is social acuity, which means you are good at interacting with people and understanding people and imitating them. In the sense that like you can speak their language or you can appeal to their beliefs or ideologies. You are proactive in problem definition. So in collective settings, a typical problem is that we don't really know we know that there are problems, but we need to like define them better to like agree on certain terms. Those policy entrepreneurs will be really good at doing this effectively and like clearly and simply. Then those policy entrepreneurs are not alone. They usually have teams, so they have people doing research for them, doing like some intelligence gathering for them, and those teams are really tight-knit, and they usually consist of people that really highly trust each other. They lead by example, so they're not the type of political actors that will say something and then they will try to like manipulate others. Like the person will basically understand that policy is a long-term process, and will try to like develop healthy relationships over time by like being a principled actor. And then strategic thinking is basically trying to anticipate maybe news that will arrive, and then how to instrumentalize those news to combine them with their own preferences and then to push this. So policy entrepreneur in a policy network is basically an actor that comes and, oh, I'm connected to almost everyone, I understand everyone, and I can coordinate the network. Have you seen a normal distribution before? Yes, kind of. Yeah, cool. I think Roger Hallam has one, or like has many in his talks that I briefly watched. So basically, we can argue that in the middle you have most policy actors. Basically, people that are engaged because they have some goals, they have some preferences, and they just do their work given the structures. And policy entrepreneurs are basically like on the tail end, and that's where you want to be if you want to influence policy making effectively. So that just gives you an intuition also that this is very few individuals, maybe like 1% of the policy network or even less, that actually have disproportionate impact on the system. If we have all of this, we can think about leverage points to influence policy. Kind of like in an abstract way, without talking about tactics right away. There are 4 key leverage points. One is information provision, which is, I would say, what 80% of policy actors actually do, which is publishing reports, giving speeches, conducting new studies. A strike can be a form of like information provision because you send signals about a problem. So you basically like generate information that you target, that you use to target specific actors. Another leverage point is information processing. So it's basically how basically people will judge and select the information you bombard them with. And this is subject to cognitive factors, but also to social factors. And you could try to improve the way those processes happen. It's a bit more complicated. You can change networks, so you can change like who's involved in decision-making processes. You can change network structure, so you can try to place certain individuals in policy. You can try to change certain relationships, so you can have 2 people that know each other and you want them to hate each other or the other way around. And you can change the norms in those networks, so you can change perhaps like what is perceived as like a principled action versus what is perceived as someone that should be like punished or discarded. So you can change like network structures and processes. And arguably when people want to push for more representation, that's what they do. They try to bring more people inside policy networks. And what you can do is change the system goals or rules. So you basically try to change how the parliament works, or you try to create a citizen assembly. That's typically changing like an institutional structure. And there are other examples, like in the literature on representing future generations. You can change, for example, the electoral system, where you give more weight to young people, or you try to incentivize young people to vote more, or you have proposals like you have a committee for the future, basically like a committee inside the institution that will represent future generations. And those will be part of the formal structures that will then provide incentives to the network. So very broadly, those are 4 leverage points. And those are details about them, so you can do many things. I won't go into details, you will have the slides. But that just like gives you an idea of like how you can then act in this like complex system. In summary, what we did, we looked at policy outcomes, the fact that it's non-linear and that it's mostly stable. We looked at actors and like social, like policy networks. We looked at how it interacts with the environment, like the changing world, the media, and institutional structures. And then we looked at different ways, basically, those processes lead to policy outcomes. And then we looked at leverage points here and there. And that's the end of the first part.